Thank everyone, and thank you so much for joining this webinar. Today we have Dr. John Glenn with us, who is a visiting lecturer at the Cranfield School of Management. He regularly comments on UK and global macroeconomic issues and the finance of football on BBC Radio and television, having given more than 75 interviews in the last 3 years. John was director of the Executive MBA from 2002 to 2004 and the full-time MBA from 2004 to 2007. Now, in a world which has been hit by frequent supply shocks and companies are thinking about supply chain resilience, we thought it would be timely to have John here with us to discuss trends and drivers in nearshoring and reshoring. He will address whether they are a myth or a reality and look at it from a North American and European perspective. John, you can start now, and if there are any questions, please post them in the Q&A chat box. I will, we'll address the questions after John is done with his prepared comments.
Okay, so first of all, Sonali, thank you for inviting me to speak. Thank you for turning up. I know that I'm sitting between most of you and a big football game this evening, if not your dinner, so I shall hopefully say something that is of interest to you. Just briefly about my background, I joined the economics faculty at Cranfield in 1999, taught economics predominantly on the MBA. Research interests is in housing economics, which is where my PhD is. I got my PhD at the University of Tilburg in the Netherlands. And I also did quite an amount of work on the efficacy of breast cancer drugs post-relapse. So I've then moved into working with the Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply. So in terms of nearshoring, reshoring, supply chain challenges over the last 4 or 5 years, SIPs and procurement people have probably sat on the painful end of the environment that we find ourselves in. But then my other work is with logistics providers. Primarily, I work with Kuehne + Nagel, the German logistics organization, and they're on the other side of the deal the last 4 or 5 years. Chaos is always good for carriers, the Hapag-Lloyds, the MSCs, the CMAs of this world, the big carriers like Maersk, and the other one. And it's also good for the freight forwarders. They tend to make very, very large sums of money in times of chaos. So that then has begat a process, or at least a conversation around nearshoring, reshoring, onshoring, friendshoring. You know, the labels are numerous, used interchangeably, and sometimes not used in technically the right way. But we will forgive people for that. What I want to look at today is the extent to which this nearshoring or this shortening of supply chains has actually happened to any great extent in Europe and in North America, or to what extent is it talked about to a large extent but not delivered upon. Okay, I'm more than happy, given that I've worked at Cranfield for a large number of years, for people to shout at me as we're going through. So if I say something that really upsets you and you feel you've got to challenge it straight away, please feel free to put your hand up or just to come off mute and shout out loud. Because I'm part of the Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply, I gave you this global state of procurement document that we produced very, very recently. It's only published in the last couple of weeks, where we're looking at the profession in the spotlight and asking a whole series of questions about how the procurement profession is meeting the challenges that I just talked about. In respect of global supply chains, the current top supply chain risks, the current things that are in the mind of procurement professional Obviously, geopolitical factors, the war in Ukraine, Gaza, um, the impact of Brexit, the fact that we have got in Europe the impact of closing of the Suez Canal, or at least Houthis being active in the Red Sea, and therefore leading to carriers diverting around South Africa, and the impact that that has on supply chains, labour shortages, both in the UK and outside the UK, and definitely in North America, meaning that it's difficult to actually get people into procurement, into ports, into warehouses, to actually do the job, if you like, of delivering on supply chain, shifts in demand due to pandemics and COVID, and then government intervention, regulation, and natural disasters. So the usual menu of things that are influencing procurement people, the usual menu of things that will be being brought, I would say, to the board table in many organizations, and therefore people deciding whether or not they're going to reshore, nearshore, or onshore. And again, if we go back 5 years, or if we go back 6 years, supply chain and procurement, frankly, nobody cared about. Nobody cared about because it worked so well. Procurement people typically didn't get a seat at the board. Supply chain people definitely didn't get a seat at the board. And now the primacy of those functions has been elevated inside organizations because of the challenges that we faced in the last 5 or 6 years. Okay, this has led to a suggestion that what we need to do is we need to shorten our supply chains. We need to bring back our supply chains to geographical locations, which, if are not immediately proximate to where maybe goods are assembled, final assembly, or are not immediately proximate to the final consumer, are brought a lot closer to. So typically, if we want to stylize this would mean that for the UK, nearshoring would be bringing activity back into Europe, or for the rest of Europe, it might be bringing activity into Eastern Europe to drive activity in what we used to describe as Western Europe. Okay, and then in North America, the big emphasis is on increased activity in Mexico, and I will speak to that, and what used to be called the maquiladoras in northern Mexico, and then cross-border activity into North America to supply either final product or to supply intermediate product into North American markets or organizations. Okay, so we've seen a lot of that presumably happening. The extent to which it's a myth or reality is something that I want to examine now. Okay, so the first port of call for a very rough and ready analysis was to look at trading goods by country, by commodity imports for April 2024. So this data set, which you can get at the ONS, you can play with yourself, looks at annual data going back to 2018 by commodity, by country. Okay, so it's quite a large data set, but we're not going to 3 or 4 digit NIAC codes. Okay, we're at the 2-digit level at best. But then again, sufficient data, I would argue, for us to at least start to examine whether or not there is a kind of prima facie case that reshoring or nearshoring is happening to a significant level in Europe and in the UK. So I would say, as far as the UK is concerned, there's little macro evidence of significant reshoring over the period 2018 to 23. Data for actually for intermediate goods. So if we look at the data sets that look at intermediate inputs into electronics, electrical, manufacturing, semi-manufactured, what you're actually finding there is that imports from China have risen since 2018. Now, whilst those imports have risen at relatively small percentages, typically 20–25%, then that's probably flat, as it were, compared to 2018. If we were to look at it in real terms, the data is in current prices. Rising imports is in line with imports from Europe on a percentage basis. Sorry, that's not actually phrased that well. So if you look at imports from Europe and the extent to which they have increased into the UK since 2018, okay, for the same product or commodity categories, then the rise in imports from China is broadly in line with the rise in imports from Europe. So what we're not seeing is a kind of transfer, or at least a prima facie evidence that there's a transfer of activity from China into Europe and then from Europe into the UK, okay, over that period. There are obvious outliers, okay? If you go to telecoms, it's immediately apparent that because of regulation and trade barriers and all the stuff around Huawei, that you see, particularly telecoms capital spend, not so much telecoms intermediate, but telecoms capital spend has absolutely collapsed, from something like £4.5 billion pounds worth of imports in 2018 to something like 35. And then on the reverse side, if you look at automotive, and particularly automotive final product, okay, there's been a massive expansion there. And now China is the second most important country in terms of imports of cars for the United Kingdom. Only Germany. We only import more cars, final cars from Germany, okay? So what you're actually seeing there is, if you examine the data, is there's no obvious pattern that's coming out that suggests significant shifts in where the UK is importing goods from, and particularly importing intermediate goods from. So that would suggest that there hasn't been this great shift in reshoring or nearshoring as far as Europe is concerned, as far as the UK is concerned, sorry, and its imports from Europe as opposed to China. Now, what we then have to do is be aware that we don't avail ourselves of this cognitive bias where we take the particular and we escalate it to the average, okay? So we do see, and again on a very minor micro level, significant, or not significant, but stories of onshoring that get significant amounts of press, okay? But what we're looking at here is, if we look at the complete, the large numbers as far as imports are concerned, there's no real evidence of significant reshoring outside one or two particular cases, and those cases are in automotive. Now, contrary to that, some people might argue that 2023 is a turning point, and again, you can examine the data and make this look at this for yourself. Okay, so if we look at EU trading goods with China 2013 to 23, you see the drop off between 22 and 23. And indeed, if you examine the previous data set that I referred to, then actually what you see is a drop off between 22 and 23 across many of those commodity categories that are in that data set as far as trade with China is concerned. But the key thing there is we're still nowhere near dropping below what levels were in 2018, and definitely nowhere near below what levels were in 2013. And essentially what I would argue here is if you look at the blue line, which is imports from China at the top, essentially what's happening in 22 is we're returning to what you might describe as a long-term trend that was exhibited into pre-COVID. And, you know, if you were to extend that, the data point for 23 would obviously be just about at that level. On the right here, if you just allow me for 1 second to minimize faces that are available, you can start to see where there have been what might be described as significant reductions in 23 compared to 22. So telecoms equipment, which is, you know, we're at sort of 60 billions of euros of imports, so significant quantums of Europe's electronic machinery, you know, going down through all of those. This is at 3-level category. So what we're seeing there is potentially a degree of less dependency on China, but obviously you would need to then look at other data to confirm that this was then being offset by increases in imports from Europe, for example. Okay. I don't know what's happened to my So typically also what we need to look at, and you know, as trained economists, you will know that normally if you look at the interaction between any countries, you know, China and Europe, it's normally about trade initially. We then gravitate to investment, okay, and if you're looking at recent investments, this is electronic vehicles, you see enormous increase in electronic vehicle investment in recent years. It has to be said that is contrary to the total FDI from China, where a significant amount of Chinese investment has occurred in the period pre-COVID, and if anything, Chinese investment has failed to recover post-COVID for reasons that we might look at in a moment. And then there's this notion that what happens eventually is we take some of that activity, or what we're looking to do at the moment is to take that activity and reshore it. And obviously, I've shown that in the context of North America. But again, we have to look at what's happening in the background to facilitate this. So we saw the primacy of the WTO into sort of, if we want to delineate, you know, the world as pre and post the Brexit vote. So pre-Brexit, you could argue that there was a primacy of WTO. There was significant trade between China and Europe, and then you saw the investment starting to happen. And that investment was going along rather well. We had the EU-China Comprehensive Agreement on Investment, which was put in place in 2020 and lasted for 5 months. Okay, it was then shelved, or it was then suspended, okay, because of increased geopolitical tension between China and North America, between China and the rest of the world. And so what we've seen is this constriction of trade and increased protectionism post-Brexit. I'm using Brexit as an arbitrary number there, that I'm not suggesting there's any causal effect. Okay, so pre-Brexit, we got WTO doing all of its good stuff, massive increase in trade. We got increase in investment, but now we're starting to see some barriers to that investment appearing. We're getting increased protectionism, and within protectionism, we get something like the CHIPS Act. We get increased subsidy. We got North America investing 52 billions supporting the semicon market, which is a massively strategic sector for both North America, Europe, and the rest of the world. Okay, still 70% of our chips are coming out of, or until very recently, were coming out of Taiwan. We've seen similar investment in Europe. No, we've seen a similar type of investment, but at a quantum which is significantly lower. We're looking at $2 or $3 billion being put into investment in chips in Europe. Okay, and then the UK trying to build up some semicon capability, but again on a quantum which is not the same as that which is occurring elsewhere. So what am I trying to show here? I'm trying to show that there's this natural flow between trade, between investment, and now increased not a natural flow too, but we see a sort of kickback against that, increased protectionism, restriction of investment. Okay, so capital flows not happening, trade flows not happening, a retrenchment back behind trade barriers, increase in subsidies for chosen industries, and the net effect of that then is what we're trying to look at in terms of all this nearshoring and reshoring. So trade diversion, yes, to a certain extent that's happening. So with increased protectionism, we're seeing rise in countries like Vietnam, okay, or with increased trade disputes, we're seeing a rise in trade of Vietnam. This is the FRED data for Vietnamese imports into the US, and they're currently running at somewhere between 10 and 12 billion dollars a month. Okay, so you see an enormous increase in Vietnamese trade, even since 2015. Okay, again, delineating with Brexit, that's a pure coincidence, I trust, I promise you. Okay, so what's happening here? We're seeing that the United States disinclined to trade with China for geopolitical reasons. The Chinese, we're trading with Vietnam, or the US is trading with Vietnam, but as we all know, it's trading predominantly with Chinese companies which have relocated into Vietnam. And then you see Putin recently visiting Vietnam. That's the Vietnamese prime minister or president, so I'm not sure which one, meeting Putin. And again, that adds to this geopolitical mix. So you've got vast Chinese investment in Vietnam, a degree of presumably Chinese influence on the Vietnamese politic. You've got Putin then visiting Vietnam. You've got Vietnam up to date being a preferred trading partner with the US, and then that geopolitically having to unwind. So yes, we're getting trade diversion because of the political disputes. I would say that this is almost reshoring in the sense that you're picking a different trading partner to trade with, okay, as opposed to nearshoring, bringing it nearer to home. But again, it's something that we have to look at as the global trading patterns revolve. So if we look at Mexico as a reshoring or a friendshoring location, i.e. it's politically more aligned with North America. This is Monterrey, which I visited recently. I was working with the road haulage business of Kuehne+Nagel in Monterrey. They need to go to Monterrey to see this. You need to see this to believe it. As you fly into Monterrey, you literally fly over miles of manufacturing and distribution units. So what's happening there is you've got an enormous, what we used to call maquiladora in Monterrey. Vast amount of activity has been diverted there and is producing for North America. Yes, a lot of it promoted by NAFTA or the USMCA agreement, as it's now referred to. So significant reshoring in Mexico, but also what you're seeing is significant Chinese investment in the maquiladoras of Mexico to get around the problem of trading with China directly. So vast investment of final product development. So BYD and Chery, the Chinese, and MG soon, the Chinese vehicle manufacturers have either put the shovel in the ground or are about to put a spade in the ground and start putting capacity in place in northern Mexico. And obviously for Kuehne+Nagel, the significant interest in shipping the stuff across the border. So you now go to the point where, as I'm sure you all know, Mexico exports more to the United States than China currently does. Okay, it's overtaken China as the United States' most important trading partner. Okay, now the key issue here, of course, is the USMCA, the US, Mexico, and Canada Free Trade Agreement is up for renegotiation in 2026. Okay, and given what's happening with the US election, given the probability that Trump will get elected and will take potentially could take a very negative view of what's going on in northern Mexico in terms of Chinese companies relocating, there's a whole dynamic that has to be worked out there. So you've seen the impact of reshoring. The impact of reshoring here is not a myth. It's an enormous reality. There is massive amount of activity in northern Mexico. There's a significant amount of capacity there in terms of cheap and productive labor that can deliver on what's needed. There is plenty of space. Infrastructure may be an issue, and obviously crime and corruption are significant issues. But it doesn't seem to be putting people off, as it were. So the whole Mexico reshoring, friendshoring, and nearshoring activity is very, very real. But as I said, the USMCA provision is up for renegotiation in 26 and is definitely something that's worth watching. So back to the micro effects. There's a really cool paper that I came across literally in the last couple of days, which is looking at lithium, Brexit, and global Britain and the impact that it has on the onshoring of battery production networks in the UK. And this is done in an incredibly systematic way, where what the two authors are looking at is they're not looking at individual elements of the battery supply chain. They're actually looking at the whole end-to-end network of battery supply chains, and then looking at the extent to which that can realistically be onshored into the United Kingdom. So there's obviously evidence of significant investment, and this is what gets the press. Tata and JLR and Nissan investing in battery production in the UK. The argument of the two authors is that there's a lack of an ecosystem. There's a lack of a global network, is what they call it, a complete network to support production. And this focuses on links with research universities. And again, their hypothesis is that it's not that the research isn't being done. It is being done. It's just that the whole supply chain is not linked into that in a systematic way. There are not links with government industrial strategy. So again, the whole piece about what I've got at the bottom called state entrepreneurialism, whereby the state is supporting battery activity in a way which links up with an industrial strategy, and where we're not leaving what might be deemed as industrial strategy to a sort of neoclassical laissez-faire approach to letting the private sector get on and sort this up. The danger is, and this is the author's hypothesis, is that we end up with all of the pieces of the supply chain, but they're not coordinated. As a Scotsman, I'm so tempted to say a bit like the England football team. Okay, so we've got all of the pieces, but we're not sure that we've got them all in the right place and that they're all working together for a single purpose. So I think that kind of again looks at almost the last link in the chain in terms of the reshoring and onshoring debate. You know, I for a number of years have been saying, you know, that we've got capacity and capability issues. So as we onshore stuff, you know, if any of you out there are as old as me, and I truly, I'm sorry for you if you are, but if I can remember the 1970s and 1980s when manufacturing industry was 30% of the UK economy. Okay, currently less than 10%. So the idea that we can bring back an onshore manufacturing capability and, you know, it'll rise like a phoenix from the ashes in an uncoordinated way because market signals will make that happen, I'm not sure. Okay. So this is what these guys are talking about. So we need the capability, we need the capacity, and we need the networks and the ecosystems to be put in place and to be working effectively if this onshoring piece is going to work. Otherwise, what I think will happen is we will go back to relying on the carriers, the people that I work with, Kuhn and Nagel, who prior to COVID did a brilliant job, and you'd never heard of them. You may never have heard of them now, okay? Because those supply chains work so well, and we'll go to the places in the world where it's best to secure those supplies, and we'll return to a situation where we have very, very low rates of inflation with vast increases in the money supply, because when that money actually asks the real economy, the global real economy, to produce, it does so. And I think that's another thing that we have to think about when we get global reshoring and onshoring, is that if we're not reshoring and onshoring to areas that are as productive, that are as cost efficient, then there is going to be a price to be paid in terms of increased prices. Okay. Finally, and I think I've probably spoken a little bit too long, Sonali. I definitely have, and you've been very kind not to shout at me. This is a piece that I've used forever from McKinsey's that they produced I think just before the pandemic. And essentially, they looked at a series of global risks and your ability to anticipate it in terms of the lead time on the horizontal axis, and then on the vertical axis, the estimated cost of the shock. Okay, and it's slightly frightening how many of these have materialized, and I've left some of them out. I've only looked at one or two. So extreme pandemic, we've had trade disputes, we're starting to have local military conflict. We've obviously had with Ukraine and Gaza. Okay, the ones that you might worry about, systematic cyber attack, you get no or very little ability to anticipate, and the impact could run into many trillions if that were to happen. Okay, and then obviously the danger of potentially global military conflict and the impact that might have. So these are the kind of risks that are starting to emerge, and as those risks emerge, there has to be a supply chain response, and the supply chain response in some parts is to reshore or nearshore or onshore. Now, my contention at the moment is that that is significant in North America, particularly in relation to Mexico, and maybe less so in Europe. With that, I'm going to thank you for your attention. Apologize for speaking maybe a bit longer than I planned to. And I'm more than willing to take questions now. I know that there's one in the Q&A. So Sonali, if you want to.
Yeah, sure. Thanks a lot, John. And, it's been really interesting to see you drill down into the data rather than the headlines. So the first question we have is saying that some of the analysis presented today, for example, your chart on declining US imports from China or rise in US imports from Mexico, they seem to have been crystallized only in 2023. How confident are you that the latest year of data is indeed indicative of a trend that will continue in coming years?
Absolutely not is the answer to that. I think I made that point with respect to the EU and to the UK's importing from the EU that I don't think it's a trend on 1 year's data. I think the trend, if you were to look at the Mexico's exports into the US, or the US's imports from Mexico, I think they've been on the increase significantly over a number of years, not just the last year. I think the fact that the crossovers happened in the last year has probably got to do as much with the long-term trend into from Mexico into North America, and the very, very short-term effects of trade disputes with China. I would argue that in the medium term, I'd expect those trends to continue. I would expect there to be conflict with China. Okay, I don't mean military conflict, but I do think, continued tensions in the South China Sea, continued tensions with China and US over trade, over human rights. If Trump is elected, which is now on the balance of probabilities looking more likely than it is less likely, no, I would be confident that those trends would increase. And I would encourage anybody to go to northern Mexico if you get the opportunity, just to see what's happening there. I mean, it was truly jaw-dropping flying into Monterrey. And I accept, before anybody says it, that Monterrey is an important economic node,
Great. Thank you so much, John. Do we have any other questions? Please type it in the Q&A box or in the chat box, if that's easier. While we wait, maybe just to pick up on a point from you on the elections and the political risks going forward, do you think now, I mean, of course, you discussed that, if potentially Trump comes in, we are going to see this trend accelerate probably even more. What do you think role Europe has to play? Do you think friendshoring and nearshoring would become more prevalent in Europe, as well as Europe also thinks about tariffs that Trump potentially might impose even on this side rather than just China?
I think perversely, and I think we've seen it to a certain extent in the data from what I've suggested, I think Europe's role is to keep the door open to China. And I think that's a role that Europe sees itself playing, particularly if there was a Trump presidency. I think that would become even more acute. I therefore think, potentially what happened in France at the weekend was a really good thing. I think that, anti-Chinese sentiment in Europe would be a bad thing, not because I think that we should support China, but I think there needs to be a balance to what's happening with Trump. We have to keep the door open for negotiations. And I think you can see that there is a greater willingness in Europe to trade with China. I don't think we're putting up as many protectionist barriers. I think, we're taking steps in semicon, nowhere near as much as we should, to sort of offset any reliance on Taiwan. But I don't see at the moment, I don't see why the Chinese, and I don't understand Chinese politics, so I'm saying from the outside, but from a Western perspective, I wouldn't see the logic of China putting boots on the ground in Taiwan, particularly when the West is so dependent on semicon. Perversely, what I think is if the US develops its semicon capability and becomes less dependent on China, I think at that point the Chinese might put boots on the ground in Taiwan. So it's a weird relationship that's going on. That was a rambling answer to your question, Sonali.
Very interesting. We've got a couple more questions. Firstly, is the investment into Mexico primarily assembly?
No, there is some assembly, yeah, but there's also the supply chain is following it. The supply chain is definitely following the Chinese investment into Mexico. So what you're getting there is you're getting a lot of intermediate good production as well in Mexico, as well as final product. But yeah, if I'm talking about BYD or I'm talking about Chery or MG, they're going to be assembling product there. But it's not just the final assembly that's been exported in there.
Right. Then we have another one. I've heard it said that companies are often not changing their existing supply chains, but are choosing nearshore destinations for new investments. Do you see any evidence of that?
Absolutely. Yeah. So what you're doing is you're mitigating the risk as and when. I'm now struggling to think of an example. Okay, but I'm sure the person who asked the question has got an example, have they?
Yeah, I mean, I think they can just type,
Ah,
unfortunately,
right, okay.
rather than shout
my
out.
God, dearie me.
So
This is why we
let's,
should.
it's sorry, you just have to go through me. But yeah, they haven't typed anything. But maybe we
I can allow speaking if you want to. We don't normally, but if you want me to.
Oh yeah, let them speak. Yeah.
Want to speak, put their hand up. Yeah.
It's much more fun. They can shout at me and say,
he said not really. So.
"All right, okay. But I suppose you've seen it with the whole electric vehicle thing, aren't you? So if you look at what Nissan have done, if you look at what Jaguar Land Rover are doing, okay, they're actually at the point where they're making significant investment in electric vehicle. They're looking at battery technologies coming to coming to the UK. So there is evidence of them nearshoring or reshoring. For me, now just to conflate the whole debate, I think what will be really important now with our new government in the United Kingdom is that we have two things happen. We have closer trading relationships with Europe, whatever that looks like. And now I know they said they're not going to join the customs union and they're not going to join single market, but something that is facilitates trade, makes trade easier, so that we stop, first of all, the offshoring of activity from the United Kingdom into Europe, because it's easier to do stuff in Europe and trade from there than trade from the United Kingdom. Okay. And then the reshoring of activity into Europe, and particularly, Eastern Europe, so IT into Poland, automotive going into places like Hungary, Romania, okay, and then free trade of that supply chain back into the UK. And I think hopefully the government over the next few years will be able to work on that. Yeah, my own preference would be a Norway agreement, just get back in the customs union. But hey, I don't want to upset half the people on the call.
Moving away from Brexit, next question is the lead in time for physical relocation obscuring the scale of reshoring in North America and EU? That means, is it just still planning phase right now? And we might see some in the future.
And I think the lead in time in North America is proving that lead in time shouldn't reduce the effect. So essentially the thing that's happening there is, once you can get round maybe the corruption and safety elements, and you can start putting your spade in the ground. In Mexico, things seem to happen very, very quickly. What we've got to do if we want to facilitate activity here is to make sure that we allow people to reshore swiftly. But then, it's why I introduced that final paper. I think having the capacity, the capability, and the ecosystems that are in place, so bringing back activity from China, for example, a tier one supplier. What you can't bring back, or it's very difficult to bring back, is the tier 2, 3, and 4, and 5 that the Chinese manufacturer, the tier 1 manufacturer, has built up in China. Okay, so how do you bring all of that back? It's incredibly difficult to do, and that's again what that example with battery technology was looking at. You have to put that whole supply chain together, and the ecosystem in which the supply chain sits in order to reshore. So it's a difficult exercise.
Yeah. Then we have another one. The question is, do you see trends for OECD customers to look to diversify their exposures to particular countries or regions?
Yes, to a certain extent, but being driven, I would say, ultimately being driven by regulation, ultimately being driven by protectionism. Okay. Do I see significant reinvestment, which is about, dealing with the problems of the Houthis in the Red Sea, or, the impact of, strikes on the West Coast, in the ports on the West Coast, or whatever it is? Yeah. No. I think procurement professionals have dealt with that for years. It's the job of a procurement professional. So what they're actually doing is, to a certain extent, they might be holding at the moment slightly more stocks. They might be looking for alternative suppliers, but that was always the case. Yeah. And if your most effective supplier is in China, it appears to be the case that, given the EU stance to China, we're still going to trade with China. Okay. And it's the job of the people that I work for, the Kuehne Nagels of this world, and the Maersks and the CMAs and the airlines to get those goods to where they need to be.
Great. Do we have any more questions? I don't see any in the box, or but if any final questions. I could maybe ask the last one, if you may. It's just, again, I think in the last few minutes you touched on inflationary shocks. Now, how do you think inflationary shocks would become more common or less common with people nearshoring and friendshoring? Is this a way to make your supply chain resilient, but maybe it comes at a cost of high inflation temporarily?
Yeah, I think it potentially could come at a cost of higher prices. But I go back to what I've said before. The global supply chains are readjusting. They will readjust to the political realities. We have seen a degree of reshoring or nearshoring. But again, if you look at what's happening in Mexico, it's still a combination of low wage and high productivity that's giving you the cost advantage going into North America. So unlikely to be inflationary pressures. We still see the United Kingdom and Europe significantly bringing materials and finished goods in from China and from Asia and places like Vietnam. So that kind of, manufacturing, that enormous workplace of the world, to use what we used to call ourselves in the United Kingdom, that China has become, I just don't see that diminishing. And yes, it will go out to Vietnam and it will go out to Indonesia, and who knows what's going to happen in North Africa. Okay. But again, I think we'll see, we've been incredibly capable over the last 20, 25 years in the global economy, and definitely in the post-2008 sort of financial crisis period, to have vast amounts of money supply pumped into our economies. Many Western economies running at close to, if not over full employment and no inflation. Yeah. So all of the guys with their MV equals PY here, somebody's producing output somewhere to stop the average price level going up. Yeah. And this is what China and its global supply chains have been able to do. Okay. And the reality, if we're looking at myths and reality, the reality is that it's done it incredibly well. And the thing that is going to mess it up is protectionism and is geopolitical conflict. They're the shocks that are going to mess it up at the moment. If we can allow those supply chains to work effectively, they'll continue to deliver us the goods and services and the quality and the choice that we've had for the last 20, 25 years.
Right. I think that's a very good note to end this webinar. We don't have any further questions, but if there are any questions, feel free to reach out to me or Dr. John, who I'm sure would be happy to answer them. But I would just like to thank everyone for joining. I know it's there are lots of football and other things going on, so I think we'll give you your 5 minutes back and let you go back to your football. Just a quick note, in case there are any non-SPE members on the call, Katie would briefly put the link up to SPE if you want to join the SPE membership. There's a link which will give you details on how to do that. It's a really fun society, lots of events with people like Dr. John, but also many other people, and annual conference and dinner. So lots of things to get from here. But I would like to thank all of you for joining, and have a good evening.